and there'll be a little bit of new and material because I guess Bangladesh has had a lot going on this year. Yeah. We're going to include some of that in the UPL edition, but there are basically three characters in this book. Number one is one of the characters is Muhammad Yunus. It just so happens, for someone of his stature, there is no proper biography of Professor Yunus. There should be. Someone should write it. But until that does, this book is actually the closest there is to a proper biography of Muhammad Yunus. And he's only kind of 1/3 of the book. But I track him. He sat with me, told me about his childhood. He taught me about his years in the U.S., the early years starting Grameen, and I took the highlights of that, and you see them woven throughout the book. The second character is a village in Manikunj called Kolshi. And it's and I spent months and months and months in this village. At the time, it had not only no air conditioning, no electricity, no running water. I mean, I kind of roughed it out there. This was the 90s back there, and so I really got to know the people in this village. I was deeply re-interviewed for over 2 years. Probably about a dozen of the Grameen Bank clients, and then another like 2 dozen I would talk to occasionally, and so it was, as you realize, the things that someone tell you, just like the first day you meet someone, a friend, the things they'll tell you on the first day, and the things they'll tell you 2 years later when you're buddies. Well, by being in that village repeatedly over 2 years, and then going back every few years since then, people would reveal things to me, or I would have a deeper understanding of how Grameen played a role in that village. And BRAC was also there doing really excellent work in their non-formal education. So the depth of understanding would just grow. And people who kind of parachute into a village and talk for a few hours and think they understand what's in that village, and I've done that in other places, but in Kolshi, I really went deep, and I just went back and back and learned, and just would learn more with every visit. And the third character in the book, this is kind of interesting. My publisher, of the first edition, Random House, they said, "Is there anything going on with Grameen in the U.S.? Because for the U.S. reader, it would make it more real." And I said, "Yeah, there is a small program in Chicago that's using the Grameen approach in Chicago." And they said, "Well, why don't you make that a part of the book?" And not knowing any better, young, but I said, "Sure, let's do it." But immediately, I basically had to make 9 trips to Chicago over 2 years, one of which was for an entire summer to see how Grameen was working there. And it was different in some ways, but it was actually very similar in many ways. And so I became very close with 6 women in Chicago, and so these are 2 women in Kolshi, in Manikunj, and these are 2 women who were borrowers in Chicago in the mid-90s. And so you have a cohort, small group of women in Chicago and their environment, a small group of women in Bangladesh, and Muhammad Yunus. And just the book goes back and forth between the 3 of them for mainly over the course of 2 years, 1993 and 1994, but it has been updated since. And so, and here's the other thing about Grameen in the U.S. that you may not know, or some of you may know very well. This early forerunner of Grameen in the U.S., it wasn't really that successful. I mean, I picked a group that was doing pretty well, but years later, a bunch of Bangladeshis from Grameen went to New York, and they said, "We're going to make this Grameen work in the U.S., and they have created something called Grameen America that has been astoundingly successful. Look it up on the web. They're giving $1 billion of loans every year in the U.S. using the Grameen model. In amounts still averaging just $2,000 to $3,000. The woman who runs it told me a few weeks ago they were recruiting like 600 new borrowers every week. 99% repayment. I mean, it's all cashless. It's an amazing thing, and it took several decades to get the model right. So I talk about how this early work in Chicago, they kept innovating and getting better to the point that now it's a major financial institution in the U.S. I mean, regulated by because their loans are significant. So you know, again, I had a great experience. Let me oh yeah. So one of the things that Grameen does, and other great community development programs, especially with the economic elements, like Grameen, like BRAC, like ASHA, is I think what they do is they find community leaders. And they kind of, they're already providing really good leadership in their community, but by bringing in that economic element and letting them help guide how Grameen plays out there, they're almost supercharged in their community leadership role. They can play even a more powerful role in helping the community. And so in Kolshi, the woman who was the known leader prior to Grameen, but then just played an even more important role, her name was Shanda Rani Haldar. And you just have to, and I can't even give words to the level of which she was, you know, there as a guide and a counselor, lending money to people when they needed lending money, to all the people in that village, whether they're Hindu, Muslim, neighbors, or people farther afield. And one of the things that Shanda did, besides having a lot of success in that, is she took a higher education loan to allow her, which basically one of the things Muhammad Yunus did is when the banks started generating significant profits, he said, let's use the profits to give higher education loans to the children of Grameen borrowers. And so I remember one time I went back to Shanda in the village and I asked her how she was doing, and she said, my son, we gave a higher education loan, I think it was 75,000 taka, and he's pursuing university education. And I was so pleased, and I want to tell you that son, Subhash Haldar, is sitting right here. Subhash, thank you for joining us. He's a professor of business at management in a nearby college in that area. So I'm so glad he found this event on the internet and said, "Can I come?" I said, "Can you come? That would be amazing if you came." There was another woman. So this community leadership, there was a kind of Shanda's equivalent in Chicago was a woman named Omi Ali Dupart. And her photo, this is her photo here. And she was someone who was always, she was running her own business, but she was always a problem solver for other women in her community. So not only did she, and she didn't really have much money, but she had enough to run a small business. And then on top of that, when people needed help, when people needed counsel, when people needed a little loan of $100 to make a loan payment, Omi Ali was always there. In the U.S., a lot of things, what they do is if someone's business had a problem, they would host a fundraiser, some sort of a fundraiser to help them pay off the loan. And Omi Ali, and so again, playing the role, Subhash, like your mother does, in a very different culture. And so one of the things that good microcredit does is it finds those community leaders, activates them, and gives them more of an economic tool to help them develop their own business and family, their extended family, and their neighbors and friends throughout the village. And they play an essential role in making Grameen work, and Grameen helps them work, play that community leadership role. The other story, though, about Grameen is empowering community leaders, but it's also about entrepreneurship. So I'll tell you a story. One of the neighbors of Shanda is a woman named Noni Balaghosh. Do you know though? Right? So she, basically their business is making sweets and making the raw material for Bengali sweets, many of them the cottage cheese, basically. So what happened is, I'm oversimplifying the story, you read this here, their family had fallen on hard times, and they kind of were decapitalized their business, and basically instead of doing their traditional business of making sweets and cottage cheese, the men were just out doing day labor. And so they had this skill, but the skill wasn't being used. So Grameen comes in and lends them 2,000 taka, 4,000 taka in 1987, when the branch, suddenly they said they started being able to apply this skill again. And so when I got in contact with them in 1993, they had 3 or 4 cows. They were making cottage cheese. They were making sweets. I mean, it was a busy little courtyard there. But one of the things they did, this is fascinating, and I didn't quite understand this, or they didn't tell me all the details when I first came there, but over months I kind of got the story, is that they had a contract with a sweet shop in, I think, Kolabagan. So every day they would bring kind of like, imagine like a duffel bag full of kind of a gunny sack, I guess you call it, of cottage cheese, 1 mon or 2 mon. And so they would whatever the order was the prior day, they would bring, they would say how much we need, and they would bring it there, and then they would get the order for the next day, and they'd go all the way back. And so how they transported this big thing of cottage cheese was they would get it, put it on their bicycles. The men and women would make it during the day, but then they would put it on the bicycle, 10 miles to the bus stop in Aricha, get on the bus, go all the way to Gaptoli bus stand, and then get in a rickshaw or something and take it to Kolabagan, get the order for the next day, go all the way back to their home village. And they do this every single day. So one time there was a 2-week hartal in 1994. So I couldn't go see them, and we were cut off. I came back. Oh, and by the way, one of the things with this thing is, if they ever miss a delivery, right, so bring this much cottage cheese tomorrow, if they miss, for any reason, the contract is null and void. They lose it. So that was how it worked. So I come out, and I said, this for 2 weeks, there was no buses, nothing going on, so what did you do? Did you lose the contract? And they looked at me, and this is the grit of entrepreneurs, whether Chicago, Bangladesh, whatever. They looked at me like I was kind of strange. They said, no problem. Well, how did you get the cottage cheese there? Well, they said, instead of just biking 10 miles and getting on a bus to go 60 miles, they would bike 70 miles with a big thing of cottage cheese there, deliver it, bike all the way back, and then do it again and again for 2 weeks straight. And so think about that. To keep that contract, which is, bringing them at the time of, I don't know, a few hundred, 1,000 taka a day, I don't know. But like the microcredit that got them back into their traditional business of making cottage cheese and sweets, that if it took biking, basically 150 miles a day, two of the men in the family to keep that was something they were happy to do. So that type of entrepreneurship. Then I'll tell you this woman, Omi Ali Dupart. She was, again, the community leader person in Chicago. She basically had various businesses. She was sewing, and she was making jewelry, and like so many entrepreneurs, they're involved in different businesses. So at one point she was taken advantage of in business by a bad business partner who stole money from her. By the way, those of you involved in business, does that ever happen to you? Right? Right? So this is what happens. Well, it happened to her, but unlike a lot of people, she didn't have a big capital base to just say, okay, write that $2,000 off. Like, she